Hello, I'm Tom Stapledon, and I've got another talk on behalf of the Friends of Williamson's Tunnels here. This is a talk that was presented to one of our monthly meetings, this one in February 2024. On this occasion, I've got a talk that's based around some of the writings of two historians, being James Stonehouse and Charles Hand. I've mentioned these two gentlemen many times before in my talks, and the fact is that James Stonehouse was the only man really who gave us anything that we know about the life and work of Joseph Williamson. He was around very soon after Williamson died. He came to Liverpool in 1844, I believe, after Williamson died in 1840. He had been, he moved up from down south, and he had been a reporter on the Chester Chronicle for a time. And then he moved to Liverpool, as far as I understand it, and took on a job as a market superintendent. He moved into an area of Edge Hill when he first came to Liverpool, right behind some of the Williamson buildings in Paddington. I don't think he ever lost his feeling for being a reporter and being nosy and poking his nose into other people's business and asking lots of questions and concocting stories, because he carried on his writings all the way through his life. And he wasn't just writing for the newspapers either, but he did write many stories, mostly concerning the local area and people and the streets and everything to do with Liverpool. He was a very unreliable writer because he's given us stuff that has many, many mistakes in it, but it's all we've got. And he was the first person to go into some of Williamson's underground places immediately after, or very soon after Williamson died. And he wrote about what he found in some of those underground chambers. He didn't write it very well, and he wasn't at all accurate, but it's all we've got, unfortunately. And the second historian followed on from him in the early 20th century, Mr. Charles Hand. He was a local man, and he also got very interested in Joseph Williamson and everything to do with his world. And he drew a lot on what Mr. Stonehouse had written and corrected many of the mistakes that Stonehouse had made. So between them, they've given us everything that we actually know. So let's get started. We're looking down here from the bottom end of Wavertree Road in Edge Hill. This area was to become Holland Place. And there we're looking down Paddington. This is the Bear's Paw pub in its very early days. And St. Mary's Church in Edge Hill is just off to the right of the picture. Tantalizingly, we've never had any photographs taken that show up the frontage of the Williamson buildings in Paddington, the 5-story block of buildings that he put up towards the end of his life. But there you can just see the outline behind this building in the foreground. The building here is called Derby Buildings, and the Williamson block of buildings is right there behind, but you don't really see much of it, and there isn't a picture that shows it properly at all. There we have St. Mary's Church just across the road. This was built in 1812 and opened in 1813. Not sure when this picture was taken, but I rather like it, so here it is. Now here we've got the block of Williamson buildings at the top of Paddington. Commercial buildings numbers 120, 122, 124, and 126 Paddington eventually, after being renumbered at least a couple of times. And I've shown this many, many times before. I don't have an awful lot of photographs, so the same ones are being recycled many times over in my talks. But just here, there's an entrance into what was in those days called Back Mason Street. Now, Back Mason Street looks like nothing more than an alley from there. This is much later. This is in the 1930s, I think, early 30s. The whole area was ripe for demolition at that time. A lot of slum housing behind there in Back Mason Street, because it went downhill very badly after Williamson's day. This will be number 120, part of the Williamson block. One of the few pictures we've got showing that frontage or part of it. But it looks as if Back Mason Street in earlier days was not quite as run down a place with all court houses as it became later. On this plan from somewhere between the 1840s and 60s, we have Paddington here. This is the top of Paddington, the Bear's Paw pub on that corner, and this is the row of 4 buildings, the block of buildings that Williamson put up. And there, running alongside it, which you've just seen in that photograph, is Back Mason Street. Now, this is where James Stonehouse came to live when he first moved in here. And it looks as if in those days there were some bigger houses with nice gardens behind them. So maybe not the rundown area that it was to become later. Now, if you walk right along Back Mason Street here, it then turns a 90-degree corner to the left, and it comes out again in Highgate Street, the next street up from Williamson's main area of Mason Street here, where he built most of his houses. Now, there's a nice little story that's related. I want to relate anecdotes, just a handful of little anecdotes about what Joseph Williamson seemed to be like as a man, because James Stonehouse appears to have gone around the streets of this area when he moved in there, got interested in this story of Joseph Williamson, the man who had only just recently died, and spoke to many of his ex-tenants and friends and neighbors, and he picked up stories and picked up a flavor of what the man was actually like. And he's the only source we've got for this kind of information. Now, until very recently, I was going to do this talk, and I assumed that what I was going to talk about first was a story written by Mr. Stonehouse. But I've looked at it again more closely and realized I've made a mistake. Now, I picked up part of Mr. Stonehouse's writings that were quoted word for word in a paper written by Charles Hand, the later historian, because he relied very heavily on the writings of Charles Hand. But in this particular piece of writing, it turns out that I've got it wrong. And Mr. Hand is actually talking about his own personal recollections, or actually his grandfather's, because he's written here, and I'm going to have to do an awful lot of reading in this. I don't remember all this stuff, so I'm having to read it out off the page. So he's written here, "My grandfather recollected both Mr. Williamson and some of the men he employed, and he often told me of his curious behaviour. When the great block of buildings between Highgate Street and Back Mason Street was in course of erection, Mr. Williamson was very much worried about the window tax inspectors. He had the windows carefully designed to come within half an inch of the tax limits. Day after day, these inspectors inquired how high he was going. For some time he went on building, but refused to gratify their curiosity, until one day, becoming exasperated, he exclaimed, turning round and pointing to St. Mary's Church, 'Oh, about as high as the church tower.'" And there it is. There's the church tower just across the road from the Paddington buildings. Again, we're looking at Holland Place. I really don't know when this particular photograph was taken, but obviously some years after Williamson's time, but not too long after by the look of it. Now, the thing about this story is that I've done a little bit of probing. There's what St. Mary's Church looks like now. I've done a little bit of probing and looked on some government websites to try and figure out a bit of information about the window tax. And it seems it came in the late 1700s, and it was a much hated tax on everybody who had a house. It was one of the first ways to bring in a tax on everybody, and they taxed houses on the number of windows that they had. This was finally abolished in, I think, the 1850s. I may have that wrong, but it was not too long after Williamson's death. So he was really bothered by the window tax inspectors who were badgering him all the time to know how high his buildings were going, how many windows there were going to be, and how much money they were going to get out of it. Because it was a real penalty on everybody who built a home or lived and occupied a home. The tax would have to be passed on to whoever was living in it, whether it was rented or whatever. And it seems that the window tax was levied on the number of windows in a property and not the size. So what Mr. Hand has written here as being a memory from his grandfather is wrong in some ways. Maybe his grandfather didn't understand the workings of the window tax, but it had nothing to do with the size of windows. So building them to within half an inch of the tax limit is quite wrong. Everything I've read says that it was the number, and you paid window tax on any home that had more than 10 windows. And if it had more than 20 windows, you paid it at a higher rate. And if it had more than 30 windows, you paid an even higher rate. So it did tax the richer people highly, and the poor people in smaller homes less. But still, everybody had to pay it. If you had a home with less than 10 windows, you would pay less again. Or sorry, you would pay nothing. But most houses had more than 10 windows. So it was most unpopular because a lot of people argued that it was making people build houses with fewer and fewer windows, depriving homes of light and air and causing ill health. So after a lot of fuss, it was eventually abolished. Now, this photograph from the 1930s, 1934, I think, is where Back Mason Street turns a corner and opens out into Highgate Street. And now you're looking back along Highgate Street towards Paddington again, and there is a glimpse of the back wall of the Williamson block of buildings. Not all of it, but part of it. And as you can see there are very, very few windows and very small windows. So maybe Williamson's way of avoiding the window tax was by having lots of windows on the front and on the right-hand end, as it shows in the painting. And as I know now, it appears there were lots of windows on the left-hand end as well, but very, very few and much smaller to the rear. This is a rather nice sketch which appears on the letterheads and invoices of a man called George Lineker, who was a plumber, painter, decorator, living at number 2 Highgate Street. This house here, tucked right behind the Williamson block. So that is the block of Williamson buildings there. And as you can see, there are plenty of windows in this left-hand end, and I know there were in the front and the left-hand end. So he didn't skimp on those windows, but far fewer in the rear. And there's a story about Williamson, which I think is reliable, that says that sometimes he put up his buildings in such a way that they were so haphazard in the way they went up without any real planning, that he ended up with rooms that had no windows and no doors. And he once had to modify a building by putting in a light well to get light into some of the rooms where there were no windows. Now, when we were emptying out Paddington cellars, below where these buildings stood, we did come across something at the rear of the building in the center that was very obviously something that had been a lift shaft, which went presumably up through all 5 stories of the building, 4 in this block and 5 in the next one, and down through the 2 levels of cellars below. So this lift shaft would have been for moving goods between the different levels in the building, because they were commercial buildings occupied by businesses. So this looks very much to me as a row of windows in a straight line. They may have been put in later to get light into some of these rear rooms where Williamson had omitted to put any windows in. But it appears that it started off as a lift shaft, or perhaps it started off as a light well and then got converted into a lift shaft. I can't be sure. But it wasn't exactly explained where this occurred, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if it wasn't this particular building. So it's interesting that there appears to be an element of fact behind how Williamson had this running fight with the window tax inspectors, but there were still mistakes made. There are always mistakes, always things that don't add up that we have to check out and leave us struggling sometimes to make sense of things. Now, the second little piece of writing, this concerns a gentleman who was wanting to rent a house in Parr Street. This is a story that has been taken from Mr. Stonehouse's book, The Streets of Liverpool. And on this particular page, he's relating this story. And he says, in respect to his tenants, Mr. Williamson did some out-of-the-way things. A gentleman, the father of a respected boy of the broadsheet, of long standing in Liverpool, once went to see Mr. Williamson about a house of his in Parr Street. This, I think, may be a painting of Parr Street, although I can't guarantee it completely. I found this and I'm assuming it's Parr Street. So let's pretend that it is. Anyway, well, sir, asked Mr. Williamson gruffly, who and what are you? The reply was, I am an officer in His Majesty's Excise. Oh, you are you? Well, you're just the man for me. You can look after your neighbours. They want it, I can tell you. What will be the rent of the house, Mr. Williamson? Oh, never mind the rent. You get into the house and we can talk about that afterwards. I know we shan't disagree. I would rather have the amount fixed before I take possession. Well, I thought of getting 15 or 18 pounds for it, but from you, I shall not ask more than 10 pounds. That's quite enough for you to pay. The gentleman, of course, being well satisfied, rents have considerably risen since those days, he took the house. When the first quarter's rent became due, he went to his landlord and tendered it. Be off, said Williamson, with paltry quarter's rent. I don't want it till it's worth receiving. You bring it at the end of the year, if you like, and if you don't, never mind until I ask you for it. This gentleman occupied Williamson's house for some years, until circumstances obliged him to change his locality. Some time after he had done so, he met Mr. Williamson again, who asked him where he lived and what rent he paid. He was told. Williamson remarked that he was paying more rent than he ought to do. Now, said he, as you were a good tenant of mine, and as I think you're a worthy man, I'll buy the home you live in and let you have it for less than you're now paying. This promise he actually performed, for he purchased the house forthwith and reduced the rent, as he said, fully 25%. Strange thing to do, but it's a flavour of what the man was like. So, another little story concerns a lady who was a tenant of Mr. Williamson's and was suffering from damp in her kitchen. So, this one's quite short. Mr. Stonehouse has written here, I've lost it. Right. For his tenants, he used to execute costly alterations in some cases, and for others, he would not expend a shilling. All depended on his humour. One of his houses having exhibited some symptoms of damp, the tenant complained of it. Mr. Williamson took no notice, but a few mornings afterwards, as the servant of the house was lighting the kitchen fire, she was terrified almost into fits to behold the kitchen floor all of a sudden give way, and a man started up through the hole, stating that he was making a sewer to carry off the water. Strange man. Anyway, these things may or may not be true, but I would imagine there is probably a certain amount of truth behind them. Because why would anybody make up stories like that? Now, there's another one here. And again, this is written by Mr. Stonehouse directly. And he says here of one lady, for his tenants, he used to execute costly alterations in some cases, and for others, he would not expend a shilling. All depended upon his humour. Oh dear, I'm sorry, I've already read that bit. Oh dear, let's move on to the next one. That's the lady with the damp kitchen. Right, another story concerns another lady who he nicknamed the Queen of Edge Hill. Right, a lady of my acquaintance, now this is Mr. Stonehouse speaking, a lady of my acquaintance who was his tenant for several years, related to me a curious anecdote amongst many others of him. My friend was a lady of some personal attractions and of much mental ability. Williamson took a great fancy to her and her children and styled her the Queen of Edge Hill, as he was, as he said, the king thereof. My fair informant told me, when I first came to Liverpool some years ago, I was looking out for a suitable residence for my family. It was necessary that it should be cheap as well as commodious. After wandering about all day, I was returning home with a friend with whom I was staying, when passing along Mason Street, a curious-looking man presented himself to our notice. His outward garments were threadbare and patched, and seemed to ill accord with the fine white shirt, extremely fine white flannel waistcoat that was perceptible. His mode of walking exhibited an importance that was remarkable. It was not exactly walking, but stumping, while his loud roaring voice might have been heard a long way off, as he made known his commands or wishes to a number of workmen then building the house at the corner of Bolton Street. That, by the way, is the house that Joseph Williamson built as a studio for his friend and artist Cornelius Henderson. No common man, I felt convinced, stood before us, when my friend remarked, "Here's old Williamson. He owns a great deal of property hereabouts. Let us ask him if he has such a house as you require to let." "I'm half afraid of him," continued my friend, "but do you speak to him." Having no terror of any man, I went up to the stranger and asked him in a nonchalant sort of way if he knew of a comfortable house to be let in the neighbourhood. Williamson knocked his stick on the ground with every symptom of impatience, but without replying. I then repeated my question, when he suddenly turned round and, fixing his keen eye upon me in a way that almost made me quail, he said in a gruff voice, "How should I know anything about houses? I know nothing about them and care naught." "Well, I thought you might," said I, in rather a smart tone, somewhat nettled by his rough manner. "What do you want to come to live here for?" asked he. "Why, my medical man has recommended the air of Edge Hill as being the best in the neighbourhood." "Your medical man? Pooh! I suppose he's gammoned that you into believing that if you come here, you'll live forever, and so you will have a patient that will last his life out. But you won't live forever, I can tell you." Thinking nothing further was to be done with him, and not knowing his peculiarities, we, my friend and myself, turned away. And when we had proceeded a few steps, Williamson roared out in a voice like thunder, "Here, come back, you women. Let's hear something more about the house you want." We immediately stopped, and Williamson came up to us. "Now," said he, "what sort of a house do you want?" "Why," I replied, "one with 3 parlours, 6 bedrooms, and every convenience." "And what rent will you pay?" "With 3 parlours, 6 bedrooms, and every convenience?" asked Williamson, with a sneering stress laid upon the words "every convenience." £30, said I. £30, said Williamson. "Why, what a conscience! What a liberal offer to a landlord!" When lifting up his head, to our astonishment, he roared out to his workmen at the building, "Here, all you men, come down here." The men immediately descended like a flight of birds and surrounded us, creating some alarm in the mind of my friend, while I did not feel entirely at ease. Williamson said, "Now, men, here's a woman wants a house with 3 parlours, 6 bedrooms, and every convenience," laying stress, as before, on the every convenience. "Is it likely she can get such a house for £30 a year?" "Of course not," said the men. "Did you ever hear such nonsense? £30 a year for a house with every convenience?" "Never did," said the men. "Be off then to your work," roared Mr. W. So the men, to our continued astonishment, resumed their labour as if nothing remarkable had happened to disturb their labours. When the men were all at work again, Williamson watched them for a minute or two, leaving us standing, as it were, unnoticed. Suddenly turning to us, he said, "Come this way." He then took a key from his pocket and opened the door of number so-and-so in Mason Street and bade us enter. We did so and found a house much larger than I required, the rooms of which were far beyond my means properly to furnish. I told Williamson so, and that I should prefer having smaller rooms and more of them. "Ah, well," said he, "do you like the house otherwise?" "Yes," said I, "very much." "You only want more rooms, but smaller." "Just so." "Well then, don't take a house anywhere, but come back here on Thursday next, and I'll see what I can do to suit you in some way. Good morning. There, be off. Come next Thursday. You'll find I'm a regular old screw, and if you don't pay my rent the moment it's due, I shall law you for it. Be off." As he was stumping off, I determined to give our friend a taste of my quality. So I called out in a style somewhat similar to his own, "Well, I'll come and bring my husband with me, and as he's a genuine Cockney, he can perhaps turn the screw the right way." We had no sooner left him and had scarcely got to the end of Mason Street when, turning round to take a last look of our interesting friend, we saw the men coming from the building before mentioned, and then and there followed the old man into the house we had just left. On the Thursday appointed, true to my promise, my husband and myself went back to Mason Street, and we found Williamson had gutted and refitted the greater part of the house we had looked over, and by so doing he had afforded us the accommodation we required. Williamson exultantly showed us over it and explained his future intentions for our comfort. He seemed to have almost entirely reconstructed the interior, and the expense incurred must have been considerable. And of course, being so modelled to our wish, we took it, and afterwards saw a great deal of our eccentric landlord. Soon after my youngest daughter was born, I applied to him to build me another room, remarking that he might spend his money much worse than in trying to please me, and that his men might just as well be employed in that way as any other. "No," said he, "not for £30 a year." I wished to have another room, so I wrote Williamson a letter commanding him, in Her Majesty's name, to erect me one. No notice was taken of its receipt, nor did he allude to it when next I saw him. But a few mornings afterwards, as I was washing and dressing my baby, I received a gracious reply, similar in style to my own, acceding to my request. I had hardly finished perusing the letter when I heard a tremendous knocking at the side of the wall nearest to me. Presently, portions of plaster fell down, and to my consternation and astonishment, a portion of the brickwork was removed and an opening made into my chamber. Two men immediately stepped forward, placed a doorway in it, and commenced fixing it up, while other men busied themselves in repairing the wall. For the life of me, I could not move for surprise, but I gazed on the proceedings of the men with stupid interest, when suddenly appeared in the opening Mr. Williamson himself, amidst the clouds of dust that had been raised. He exclaimed in a thundering voice, "Well, ma'am, here's a room for you. I hope it's large enough." Large enough it was, for it was 30 feet long and near half as broad, and was one of the rooms in the house he called his own. I don't know how much of these things to believe, but there you go. It's a lovely story, and I'm going to assume that there's a certain amount of truth behind some of these things, even if the stories have been embellished, perhaps even altered many times with changes in Mr. Stonehouse's memory. He carried on writing for all of his life and into a great age, and I'm sure perhaps things have changed as he's written and rewritten some of his stories, which were all published mostly in weekly form in local newspapers, and then eventually they were compiled into a couple of books, as I previously mentioned, one of them being Recollections of a Nonagenarian, and the other one being The Streets of Liverpool, both of which have at least one chapter or possibly two chapters given over to Joseph Williamson and his tunnels and these sort of anecdotes about what the man was like and the things he got up to. So that's just a flavour of the sort of things that Mr. Williamson is supposed to have got up to, according to James Stonehouse. You can decide for yourself whether you want to believe any of it or not accept it at all. But if you want to have a flavour of what the man might be like, we know he was doing all sorts of very unusual, strange things underground. So why shouldn't some of these anecdotes be rooted in some kind of truth? I hope they are, really. Just to finish off with, just because I like these old pictures, this again, I think, no, I don't know whether it's from the 1930s or whether it's much earlier. It's a photograph that I'd had before, but it's been colorized. And the software, computer software that does this is really, really very clever and very effective. Again, we're looking here at Highgate Street. That's looking towards Paddington, as the previous one was. But this one's a bit further along the street. And this is a little street called Shimmin Street. Still there. Runs from Highgate Street down to Mason Street, only a few yards long. And it joins Mason Street just below there. Just a couple of houses along the street from where Williamson's own house was at number 40 Mason Street. So just a nice little thing to finish off with. So that's about all I've got to tell you. There are quite a lot of these rather nice little anecdotes as written down by Mr. Stonehouse. So I may do something with a few more of them at some point. But for now, that's just a flavour of what I think he might have been like. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.